A millionaire and his new girlfriend attend a party and find themselves face to face with his incredibly beautiful ex-wife. The Fitzgerald mansion shimmered like a rare gem beneath the vast, star-strewn sky. It was the most anticipated event of the year, an opulent gathering where the city's elite came together, exchanging polite facades and whispered intrigues behind glasses of exquisitely aged champagne. Theodore stepped out of his sleek sports car, offering a hand to Caroline, whose presence was impossible to ignore. There was something almost methodical about her allure, a magnetism carefully curated for the evening. Draped in a scarlet gown with daringly placed slits, she was a statement in herself, a silent declaration that she belonged at Theodore's side. "You look perfect," he murmured, straightening his jacket with a practiced ease. "Remember, we're the most important couple here." Yet beneath the polished confidence, his voice carried an undertone of unease. Clara caught it, though she chose not to acknowledge it. As they stepped through the grand entrance, they were enveloped by an atmosphere steeped in refinement, the gentle strains of a string quartet interwoven with the hum of lively conversation. Theodore moved effortlessly through the crowd, exchanging greetings, flashing that signature charm. Everything seemed to fall into place, until he saw her, Adeline. She stood by the grand fireplace, a quiet smile gracing her lips, a glass of deep red wine resting effortlessly in her hand. She wore a timeless black dress, its simplicity only amplifying her quiet command of the room. The soft glow of the chandelier caught the delicate earrings adorning her ears, tiny constellations that flickered with every graceful movement. She was impossible to ignore. For a fleeting moment, Theodore's composure wavered. A pang of something unspoken, guilt, nostalgia, perhaps even regret, washed over him before he could suppress it. Clara followed his gaze, and the moment her eyes landed on Adeline, her expression hardened. "Who is she?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "My ex-wife," Theodore replied, his voice quieter now, almost reluctant. "She doesn't seem particularly rattled to see you," Clara observed, her words laced with an edge of sarcasm. And indeed, Adeline appeared utterly composed. She stood in the midst of a small group, her words effortlessly drawing laughter from those around her. When her gaze finally met Theodore's, she didn't falter. Instead, she lifted her glass in a subtle, almost indifferent toast. The gesture was small, yet impossibly significant. "Theodore!" a voice called out, breaking the spell. Gregory, an old friend and the evening's host, strode toward him with a knowing grin. "Come, meet some investors. I assume you've brought excellent company?" Clara smiled, but her attention remained locked onto Adeline, the unspoken tension simmering beneath the surface. "Of course, Gregory. Caroline's my girlfriend," Theodore said swiftly, introducing her with a practiced ease. Yet, even as the conversation shifted, a single thought lingered in his mind. Adeline hadn't flinched. She hadn't hesitated, and that more than anything unsettled him. As they were swept into the current of mingling conversations, Theodore found it nearly impossible to concentrate. His thoughts drifted, caught between the unmistakable presence of Adeline and the growing stiffness in Caroline's posture. Every polite exchange felt like an intrusion, a noise disrupting the quiet turmoil inside him. At the first opportunity, he attempted to pull away, but Caroline's fingers curled around his arm, stopping him. "You look uncomfortable," she said, her voice deceptively soft, yet carrying an unmistakable note of accusation. "It's nothing," he replied quickly, but his eyes betrayed him, scanning the room until they inevitably landed on Adeline. And then, as if summoned by fate itself, she approached. Adeline moved with the same quiet grace that had defined her all evening, unhurried, self-assured, untouched by the weight of the past. "Theodore," she greeted, her tone perfectly poised, neither warm nor cold, just distant enough to remind him of the space between them. "What a surprise!" "Adeline," he answered, forcing a smile. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Fitzgerald is an old friend," she replied smoothly, before shifting her gaze toward Caroline. "And who's this?" Clara stepped forward, her grip tightening slightly around Theodore's arm as if to stake her claim. "Caroline." "Theodore's girlfriend." Adeline extended a polite smile, but her eyes, keen, assessing, held an edge sharper than politeness allowed. "It's a pleasure to meet you." The words were simple, but the air between them crackled with an unspoken tension. Every syllable carried a hidden weight, an invisible duel playing out beneath the surface. When Adeline finally turned and disappeared into the crowd, Clara exhaled slowly before turning to Theodore. "She's stunning," she said, her voice even but laced with venom. "And she still seems to have quite the effect on you." "Don't be ridiculous," he shot back. But he didn't meet her gaze. Across the grand hall, Adeline watched from a distance, her lips still curved in an unreadable smile. But in her eyes, just beneath the surface of detached amusement, there was something else. A flicker of satisfaction, a trace of melancholy. The night carried on, flowing seamlessly like a well-rehearsed play. Laughter echoed, champagne glasses clinked, and the world moved around them. But Theodore felt it, an undercurrent of tension that grew heavier with every passing moment. Adeline's presence filled the space in a way he hadn't anticipated. No matter how much he tried to focus elsewhere, he was acutely aware of her, of the way she commanded attention without effort. And then he saw it. Her laughter, her ease, the way she moved among the guests. She wasn't the woman he had left behind. She was no longer the quiet, uncertain shadow who had spent endless nights waiting for him to return from meetings, nor the woman who once pleaded for his time, only to be dismissed. That Adeline was gone. In her place stood someone new, poised, radiant, untethered. Adeline had become something he no longer recognized, something that unnerved him. Caroline, growing increasingly wary, returned to his side, pressing a glass of champagne into his hand. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You've been acting strange ever since you saw her," she said bluntly, her patience wearing thin. "Be honest with me, Theodore. What happened between you two?" He exhaled, trying to brush it off, but Clara wasn't letting go. She held his gaze, unwavering, waiting for an answer, and for the first time that night, Theodore wasn't sure what to say. "It's nothing," he said, but even to his own ears, the words rang hollow. Theodore and Adeline's marriage had once been a perfect union, at least on paper. He was an ambitious, charismatic businessman, perpetually surrounded by power and influence. She was sweet, loyal, a gifted writer who had willingly placed her own dreams on the back burner to support him. In the beginning, there had been love, passion, even a sense of partnership. But over time, Theodore's hunger for success consumed everything in its path, leaving little room for anything else. Adeline had accompanied him to glittering events and grand parties, always by his side, always smiling, but at some point she had realized the painful truth. She was merely ornamental, a polished accessory to complete the image of his perfect life. He never really saw her. Not her sacrifices, not her loneliness, not the quiet erosion of the woman she used to be. "You knew I had dreams too," she had once said during a heated argument, her voice raw with emotion. "I wanted to publish my books. I wanted something more than just being Theodore Monroe's wife." "That again, Adeline?" he had snapped, exasperated. "I work hard to give us this life. Everything you have comes from me. You should be grateful." The words had cut deep, leaving wounds that never fully healed. He hadn't noticed the way she withdrew after that, how the light in her eyes had started to dim, how the lonely nights, waiting for him to return from meetings, had stretched endlessly. But the worst part, the unforgivable part, was that those meetings hadn't always been business. At first, the betrayals had been subtle, small indiscretions, hidden well, but eventually they became impossible to ignore. The night Adeline confronted him, she stood in front of him, her hands trembling, her voice barely steady. "You're with someone else, aren't you?" He hadn't even bothered to deny it. He had only shrugged, as if the truth was nothing more than an inconvenience. "You make too much of a drama, Adeline," he had said, his tone dismissive. "Maybe if you were more like them, confident, fun, things would be different." That was the moment she broke, the moment she realized there was nothing left to fight for. So she walked away. It wasn't easy, but the divorce had given her something she had never truly known before: freedom. She rebuilt herself from the ground up, rediscovered the passion that once burned within her, and did something Theodore had never expected. She flourished. Now, as Adeline moved effortlessly through the glittering crowd, Theodore found himself caught in the tide of memories. He tried to tell himself that there were no regrets, that he had made the right choices. But the way she looked at him now, with that quiet, unreadable expression, neither hatred nor affection, just a cool indifference, made something inside him falter. Beside him, Clara had been watching closely. She wasn't blind to his distraction. "She left you, didn't she?" she asked, her voice edged with something sharp. "I left her," he corrected, though the words came out more bitter than he intended. "But not before she became unbearable. Always complaining, always expecting more from me." Clara arched an eyebrow, tilting her head slightly. Maybe she just wanted to be appreciated. Theodore didn't answer. Instead, he took a long sip of champagne, as if the bubbles could wash away the creeping realization that, no matter how much he tried to twist the story in his favor, he wasn't as blameless as he wanted to believe. And Adeline? She had already moved on. While the couple argued in a discreet corner, Adeline was the undeniable center of attention. A renowned publisher, captivated by her literary brilliance, leaned in with admiration. "You've truly captured the essence of love and loss, Adeline. It's a remarkable piece of work." "Thank you," she responded with a serene smile. "Pain, when transformed into art, can be liberating." The words struck Theodore like a sudden blow to the chest. He knew exactly what her book was about. Every carefully chosen word, every aching confession woven between the pages. It was their marriage, dissected, immortalized. The flaws he had spent years sweeping under the rug now existed in ink for the world to see. Caroline, ever perceptive, noticed the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. She tilted her head, her voice cool. "She wrote about you, didn't she?" "Maybe, or maybe not. I don't know," Theodore said, forcing a smile that felt brittle. "I've never read anything she's written." Clara let out a quiet scoff, swirling the champagne in her glass. "Well, it looks like she's moved on," she mused, her tone laced with venom. "You should do the same." But Theodore barely heard her, because Adeline was moving toward him. Her steps were slow, deliberate, as if she had already decided how this conversation would unfold. And despite everything in him screaming to look away, to feign indifference, he couldn't. He felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on him. This moment had been long overdue, and he knew, deep down, that it wouldn't be painless. The moment she stopped just a few feet away, the air seemed to shift. The low hum of conversation, the distant clinking of glasses, everything faded. "Theodore," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "It's been so long since I've seen you, I can't even remember the last time we spoke." She paused, letting the silence stretch between them before adding, "I think it's time we had a chat." Her posture was impeccable, poised, unwavering. Theodore instinctively straightened his tie, a reflexive attempt to compose himself, but there was no disguising the tension in his expression. Beside him, Clara remained silent, her sharp eyes locked onto Adeline, analyzing every subtle movement. "Adeline," Theodore began, aiming for casual but failing. The words came out tight, uneasy. "Is this really the place for that conversation?" "I'd say so," she replied smoothly, her voice controlled but firm. "It's hard to find you anywhere else. You always seem to be preoccupied." Theodore frowned, irritation flickering across his features, but before he could respond, Adeline folded her arms, her gaze unyielding. "I would have thought that after all this time, you'd have changed. But I see the priority is still maintaining appearances, parading around with flawless girlfriends, ensuring the world sees exactly what you want them to see." Her eyes flickered toward Caroline, and though Clara stiffened, she held her composure, meeting Adeline's gaze without flinching. Theodore exhaled sharply, his patience thinning. "Adeline, this isn't the time or the place." "Ah," she said, tilting her head. "But when would that be, Theodore?" Silence. She didn't wait for an answer. "While you're here impressing strangers, your daughter, our daughter, is at home wondering why her father never calls." Her voice remained steady, but there was no mistaking the cold accusation beneath it. "But of course, sending money every month should be enough, shouldn't it? That's always been your way, buying affection instead of showing it." Theodore felt his throat constrict, the weight of her words pressing into him like a stone. Beside him, Clara averted her gaze, suddenly uneasy. Because for the first time tonight, Theodore had nothing to say. "That's not fair, Adeline," Theodore said defensively, his jaw tightening. "I do what I can. I work hard to give her what I can." "You do what you can?" Adeline let out a sharp, bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Theodore, what Amelia needs isn't a bank deposit. She needs a father. Someone who knows who her friends are, what she likes to eat, what nightmares wake her up in the middle of the night. Do you even know she's competing in a science project at school? She didn't wait for an answer, she already knew it. Of course not, she continued, her voice laced with quiet disappointment. You're too busy worrying about your next car, your next deal, the next party where you can show off your latest conquest. Beside him, Clara swallowed hard, her expression stiffening. Adeline turned to her then, her gaze shining with something between sarcasm and pity. Caroline, she said with unsettling calm, I hope you have patience. If the two of you are going to last, you'll need it. The constant outings, the vague excuses, the messages that never get answered, it all becomes unbearable after a while. Enough, Adeline, Theodore snapped, his voice louder than he intended. Nearby guests turned their heads at the sudden outburst, but quickly resumed their conversations, feigning ignorance. You don't have to put on a show here, he hissed. Adeline tilted her head slightly, her expression unruffled. I'm not putting on a show, Theodore. I'm just reminding you that responsibilities don't disappear just because you choose to ignore them. She shifted her gaze back to Caroline, her lips curving into something resembling a smile, except there was no warmth in it. Good luck, Caroline, really. And with that she stepped back, poised and unaffected, while Theodore stood frozen, visibly rattled. As Adeline walked away, she was immediately welcomed into another group, where laughter and conversation surrounded her effortlessly. A publisher, a well-known actress, several admirers, people who genuinely seemed to respect her. She moved through them with grace, her presence magnetic, her confidence unwavering. Caroline, still watching Theodore, finally spoke, her voice quieter but sharper than before. Is she right? Theodore exhaled harshly, snatching a glass of champagne from a passing tray. She's overreacting, he muttered before downing the drink in one go. You know how these women are after the wedding is over, always dramatic. But Clara didn't look convinced. She said nothing, only studying him with an expression that had grown colder. The evening continued, a seamless performance of elegance and charm for most, but not for Theodore. He couldn't stop looking at Adeline. Surrounded by admirers, she was composed, radiant in a way that made something in him twist uncomfortably. Every soft laugh, every compliment she received, every effortless exchange, it all chipped away at his carefully maintained composure. He watched as the editor from earlier returned, this time with an actress who praised Adeline's work, admiring her talent in a way Theodore never had. Adeline responded modestly, but there was something in her gaze, a quiet, unspoken knowledge. She knew the impact she was making, and that infuriated him. Theodore took another glass of champagne, then another, and when that wasn't enough, he reached for the whiskey. Caroline, still beside him, watched in growing frustration as he drowned whatever it was he was feeling in alcohol. You seem obsessed with her, she finally said. And this time, Theodore had no response. Don't be ridiculous, Theodore snapped, but irritation laced his voice, betraying his frustration. You don't understand Adeline. She always knew how to manipulate people. Or maybe, Clara shot back, her voice cool, you just never knew how to appreciate her. She turned away before he could respond, leaving her words to fester in the growing resentment inside him. Theodore continued to drink, his grip tightening around the glass, now unable to mask the bitterness clawing its way to the surface. He watched as Adeline moved effortlessly through the room, commanding attention, shining in a way he had never allowed her to before. The realization gnawed at him. By the time the evening wound down, Theodore had retreated to a dimly lit corner, slumped against the wall, an empty glass dangling from his fingers. His gaze never left Adeline. Whether it was the alcohol dulling his senses or the weight of his own choices pressing down on him, he couldn't tell. But as he watched her, flourishing, admired, untouchable, it hit him. This entire evening was a cruel metaphor for his life. A grand spectacle where he was no longer the leading man, just a supporting character in Adeline's story. And then, as if sensing his stare, Adeline turned toward him one last time before stepping out the door. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met. There was no hatred in her expression, no malice, just something far worse, indifference. And that, more than anything else, shattered him. The drive home was suffocating in its silence. Clara sat rigidly in the passenger seat, arms crossed, her gaze locked on the window, unwilling to acknowledge his presence. Theodore, still hazy from the alcohol and the wreckage of the night, slumped in the back seat without a word. He knew something needed to be said. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what, or maybe he simply lacked the courage to face the truth. As soon as the car pulled up in front of his luxury apartment, Clara wasted no time. She stepped out without waiting for him, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Inside, she finally let the silence shatter. "So that's it?" she demanded, spinning around to face him. Her voice was taut with frustration. "Are you seriously going to pretend that scene at the party didn't happen?" Theodore sighed as he shut the door behind him, rubbing his temples. "It's not that simple, Caroline. Adeline always knew how to make an impact." "Impact?" Clara scoffed, incredulous. She did nothing but tell the truth. Her voice sharpened. "And you know what's worse, Theodore? I can't even argue with her, because deep down I think she's right." Theodore exhaled harshly, his patience thinning. She overreacted. The words sounded weak even to him. Clara crossed her arms, leveling him with an unrelenting stare. "You don't even know your own daughter, do you?" Theodore stiffened. "All this time we've been together, you've never once brought her here. You never talk about her. So tell me, Theodore, how old is she? What's her best friend's name?" Silence, the kind that stripped everything bare. Clara shook her head, exhaling sharply. "You don't know, do you?" Theodore ran a hand over his face, exasperated. "Caroline, I do what I can. I work hard to maintain all of this, the house, the lifestyle. Isn't that enough?" "No," she said without hesitation. It's not." Her voice didn't waver. "And do you know what's worse?" she continued, her tone colder now. "You're still stuck in the past, stuck on Adeline. Your behavior at that party was pathetic. You drank, stared at her all night, and let her get under your skin." "That's not true," Theodore muttered. But even as the lie left his lips, he knew neither of them believed it. But Clara saw right through him. She let out a quiet, humorless laugh, shaking her head in pure disappointment. "I should have known," she murmured. "Are you really going to stand there and tell me you didn't spend the entire night looking at her? You didn't even bother to hide it?" "You're exaggerating," Theodore said, but even as the words left his mouth, they felt hollow. Clara hesitated for a moment, inhaling sharply, as if steadying herself. Then she looked at him with something raw in her gaze, something that told him this was more than just anger. "Tell me, Theodore," she said slowly, "what are we? A game to you? Am I just another placeholder, waiting for the day you decide I've run my course?" "Caroline, this has nothing to do with you or her," he started, his mind a blur of alcohol and frustration, but then, in the heat of the moment, he made the worst possible mistake. "Adeline, please, you have to understand." The name slipped out before he could stop it. Silence? A heavy, deafening silence. Caroline's expression hardened instantly, her eyes dark with something between fury and disbelief. "You called me Adeline? Caroline, I didn't mean to," he stammered, suddenly desperate. "It was a mistake. I drank too much. But it was too late." Clara let out a soft, bitter chuckle. "A mistake," she echoed, shaking her head. "No, Theodore. The mistake was thinking you were capable of caring about anyone other than yourself." She grabbed her bag without another word and turned toward the door. Theodore moved to stop her, but she held up a hand, her eyes flashing with finality. "Don't follow me," she said, her voice steady. "Stay with your ghosts, Theodore." And with that, she was gone, the door slamming shut behind her. The next morning, Theodore woke up with a pounding headache, more from humiliation than the alcohol. The argument with Clara gnawed at him, but there was something else that weighed even heavier. Adeline's words. He rubbed a hand over his face, exhaling sharply, then reached for his phone. "Cancel everything today," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'm not coming in." "Understood, Mr. Monroe," his secretary replied, but he hung up before she could say anything else. The rest of the morning dragged on, restless and aimless. He paced through his penthouse, staring out at the city skyline, but he couldn't focus on anything. Finally, unable to take it anymore, he grabbed his coat and went out. He had no destination in mind, no real reason to be anywhere. He wandered the streets, lost in thought, until he found himself at the mall, and that's when he saw it. In the window of a bookstore, sitting prominently on display, was something that sent a jolt through his chest. A book. Adeline's book. The title was elegant, understated, but the moment he saw her name on the cover, he knew it was about them. And suddenly, for the first time in years, Theodore felt utterly unprepared for what came next. In the bookstore window, an elegant display showcased Adeline's books, but one title stood out among the rest: Wings of Glass, her latest bestseller. Theodore's eyes locked onto the back cover, where a photograph of Adeline stared back at him. She looked radiant, strong, self-assured, a woman who had long since left the shadows of her past behind. But it was the synopsis that sent a chill down his spine, a heartfelt account of a love that crumbled under the weight of selfishness, betrayal, and disillusionment. A story of survival, resilience, and liberation. His throat tightened. He already knew, without reading a single page, that this book was about them. Before he could second-guess himself, Theodore strode into the store and grabbed every one of her books from the shelf. He ignored the curious glances from the sales clerks as he paid and walked out, a sinking feeling settling in his chest. Back at his apartment, he collapsed onto the sofa and opened Wings of Glass. From the very first page, Adeline's talent was undeniable. The words flowed like music, aching, raw, and honest. But what struck him hardest wasn't just her writing, it was the truth in it. She had poured every ounce of her pain onto those pages, and now there was no escaping it. In the book that so obviously recounted their marriage, Adeline painted the portrait of a woman trapped in an invisible cage, waiting for a husband who never returned, questioning her worth, feeling herself disappear a little more each day. He read about the betrayals, the empty apologies, the broken promises, and then he reached a passage that made his chest tighten painfully. I often wondered if the problem was me. Maybe I was too demanding. Maybe my love was suffocating. But deep down I knew the truth. He never saw what I had to offer because he was too busy searching for something better, something he would never find. Theodore exhaled shakily, closing the book for a moment. He couldn't keep reading, but he had to. When he finally forced himself to continue, he found the passages about Emma, his daughter. Adeline wrote about the nights Amelia cried, asking why her father never came, the birthdays that passed unnoticed, the times she sat by the window, watching for a car that never arrived. Theodore gripped the pages tightly, his breath unsteady. The crushing weight of his neglect settled over him like an unbearable weight. For years, he had justified it to himself. Work, responsibilities, the pressures of life. But as the truth stared him in the face, he knew those were nothing more than excuses. He had failed Adeline, and worse, he was failing Emma. By the time he reached the final page, Theodore put the book down and buried his face in his hands. He felt raw, exposed, as if Adeline had held up a mirror and forced him to confront the man he had become. And for the first time in years, Theodore Monroe felt something he had spent his entire life avoiding. Shamed slowly, he stood and walked over to the window. Outside, the city hummed with life, indifferent to the storm raging inside him. But something had shifted. He couldn't keep living like this. Adeline had been right. Clara had been right. And if he had any hope of redemption, if he wanted to reclaim even the smallest part of what he had lost, he knew where he had to start. With Emma, with his daughter, because if there was still a chance to fix something, to be the father she deserved, he had to try. No more excuses, just action. And this time, he wouldn't let her down. The next morning, Theodore woke up early, determined to do something different. He felt drained, but for the first time in years, it wasn't from late-night parties or endless work meetings. It was the weight of his own conscience. Sitting on the edge of his bed, he picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over Adeline's number. He hesitated before dialing. The call went to voicemail. He tried again, same result. Theodore sighed, rubbing his temple. Of course she won't pick up. With no other option, he typed out a message. Adeline, we need to talk. I know I failed as a father and as a husband. I want to change that, especially for Emma. Please give me a chance to make things right. Let me see her. He stared at the screen, waiting for a response that didn't come. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing frustrated but unwilling to give up, Theodore decided to go to the one place where he might still have a chance to prove himself. Emma's school. By the time he arrived, the afternoon sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows over the schoolyard. The gates burst open as children spilled out, their laughter and chatter filling the air. He stood by the sidewalk, scanning the crowd until he spotted her. Emma, a little girl with brown pigtails, her backpack nearly swallowing her small frame. She was walking beside a friend, giggling over some shared secret, completely unaware of his presence. Theodore's chest tightened. Had it really been months since he'd last seen her? She looked different, taller, more grown up, as if time had slipped right through his fingers without him even noticing. "Emma," he called, stepping forward. The girl turned at the sound of her name, her brow furrowing as she studied him. For a moment there was no recognition, and then it clicked. The smile vanished from her face, replaced with something that cut straight through him. Hesitation. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice uncertain. Theodore swallowed hard and crouched to her level. "Can I give you a ride home? I'd love to spend some time with you." Amelia glanced at her friend, who merely shrugged, then looked down at the pavement, shifting uncomfortably. "Mom's picking me up," she said quietly. "She didn't know you were coming." "I know," Theodore admitted, feeling the weight of his mistake. "It was a last-minute decision, but I wanted to see you." His voice softened. "Please, Emma." Before she could respond, a familiar presence approached. Adeline She wore a casual outfit, jeans, a soft sweater, but her posture was firm, her eyes sharp with both surprise and caution. Theodore braced himself, because he already knew this wasn't going to be easy. "Theodore," Adeline said, her voice devoid of warmth, "what are you doing here?" "I just wanted to see my daughter," he replied, fighting to keep his composure. Adeline exhaled sharply, crossing her arms as she instinctively positioned herself between him and Emma. Without warning? Without planning it? Her eyes narrowed. "Do you really think that's how this works?" Theodore swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "I know I screwed up," he admitted. "I'm trying to fix it. Please, Adeline, just let me spend some time with her." Adeline hesitated, glancing down at Emma, who shifted uncomfortably, her small hands tightening around the straps of her backpack. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Adeline let out a slow breath. "All right," she said at last, "but only half an hour, and only because Amelia seems willing to give you a chance." Theodore nodded, grateful for even the smallest opening. They went to a nearby cafe, the kind of small, cozy place Theodore had never really paid attention to before. Amelie sat across from him, stirring her hot chocolate absent-mindedly, her gaze fixed on the swirling foam rather than on him. The distance between them felt like an invisible wall, one he wasn't sure how to break. "So," he said, forcing a smile, "how are you?" "Fine," she answered shortly, offering nothing more. Theodore hesitated, searching for a way in. Then he remembered something Adeline had said at the party. "I heard about your science project," he said carefully. "That sounds amazing." Emma's stirring slowed as she glanced at him, surprised that he even knew about it. "It's about the solar system," she said, her voice quieter now. "I made Saturn out of clay." Theodore smiled. "Saturn's my favorite planet." Emma's eyes narrowed slightly in suspicion. "Is it?" "Yeah," he said, nodding. "The rings always fascinated me when I was a kid. When I was your age, I did a project on it too." She considered this for a moment. "Did you make the rings out of clay?" "Nope," Theodore admitted. "Toothpicks and paper." It was a disaster. For the first time that afternoon, Amelia let out a small giggle. It was barely more than a breath of laughter, but it softened something in the air between them. Slowly, hesitantly, she started to relax. She told him about the project, about how she painted Saturn's rings gold because she thought they should look royal, and how her best friend had made Jupiter but accidentally dropped it before it dried. Theodore listened, really listened, absorbing every detail in a way he never had before. For the first time in a long time, he felt present. When the half hour was up, Adeline arrived at the cafe, her eyes immediately flicking toward Emma. The Theodore exhaled, bracing himself for the goodbye. Amelia looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. Then, before she left, she asked, "Are you going to see me again?" There was a vulnerability in her voice, a hesitant hopefulness that twisted something deep in his chest. "Yes," he said firmly, "I promise." Adeline studied him, her gaze assessing, as if weighing whether this was just another empty promise. Theodore met her eyes and, for once, didn't look away. "I hope you keep it." Adeline's voice was measured, but the quiet challenge in her words lingered. Theodore watched as Amelia climbed into the car, fastening her seatbelt without looking back. When the door shut, Adeline remained standing outside, arms crossed, her gaze steady. "You're trying now," she said, her tone calm but edged with something deeper, something raw. "But have you really thought about all the time you've lost?" Theodore exhaled, nodding. "I have. A lot. Especially these past few days." He hesitated, then admitted, "Adeline, I read your books, every word. I saw how much you suffered, and now I see how much Amelia suffers. You have every right to hate me, but please, let me be part of her life, for real this time." Adeline studied him, searching his face for something, genuine remorse, perhaps, or the kind of sincerity he had so often lacked. "I don't hate you, Theodore," she said, finally. "But I don't trust you, either." The words weren't cruel, just honest. "You'll need to prove that you mean what you say. Not for me, but for Emma." Theodore nodded. He understood. Words weren't enough anymore. Back at his apartment, he stood in front of the stack of Adeline's books on his table. He ran his fingers over the covers, remembering the gut-wrenching honesty of her writing. He knew now that change had to be more than a promise. It had to be action. It wasn't enough to want to be a better father. He had to be one. As he flipped open a page, rereading a passage about the slow unraveling of their marriage, Theodore felt something stir in him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Humility. Adeline and Amelia deserved a different version of him, and he was determined to become that man. The next afternoon, Theodore parked outside Emma's school 10 minutes early. It was a small thing, arriving on time, keeping his word, but for him it felt monumental. A first step toward repairing something fragile. As he sat there, he observed the other parents. The easy way they chatted, the familiarity of their routines, they fit seamlessly into their children's lives, while he was still a stranger in Emma's. But then, the school doors opened and the children flooded out, and he saw her. Amelia walked with her backpack swinging, her head tilted as she talked to a friend. Then, as she scanned the row of cars, her eyes landed on him. For a brief second, hesitation flickered across her face, but then, slowly, tentatively, a small smile appeared. "Hi, Dad," she said, jogging toward him. Theodore smiled, reaching to open the door for her. "Hi, Angel." Amelia climbed in, settling into her seat. "How was school today?" he asked, hoping the question didn't sound as awkward as it felt. To his relief, she brightened. She launched into a detailed recount of her day, her science project, how her teacher had praised her work, how she and her best friend had come up with a secret handshake. And for the first time in a long time, Theodore just listened, letting her words fill the quiet spaces inside him. It was a sound he hadn't realized he needed to hear, and he wasn't going to let it slip away again. On the drive back to Adeline's house, Emma, usually brimming with energy, launched into a conversation that caught Theodore completely off guard. "Did you know Mom's dating?" she said casually. Theodore's fingers tensed around the steering wheel. For a split second, he nearly hit the brakes, but forced himself to keep his composure. Even as his heart clenched, he kept his voice light. "Oh, is that so?" "Yep," Amelia chirped, oblivious to the shift in his tone. "His name is Lilia. He's really nice. He takes us to the park and bought me ice cream the other day. Oh, and next week, we're going on a cruise. It's going to be so much fun." Theodore swallowed, his grip on the wheel tightening ever so slightly. Another man, filling the space where he had failed so many times. The thought sat heavy in his chest, stirring something he didn't want to name. Adeline with someone else was a reality he had never seriously considered. Not really, even though their marriage had ended years ago. But here it was. "I'm glad he makes you happy," he managed, forcing a smile. Amelia nodded, unaware of the false ease in his voice. "Yeah, he's fun, and Mom seems happy too." Then, with the effortless honesty of a child, she added, "She laughs more now." The words landed like a punch to the gut. Adeline was happy. Happy without him, perhaps even happier than she had ever been by his side. The realization left him feeling small, irrelevant, a shadow of someone she had once known, someone she had left behind. When they pulled up to Adeline's house, she was already at the door, waiting. Theodore watched from the driver's seat as she smiled warmly, greeting Amelia with open arms. The sight filled him with conflicting emotions. Gratitude for the way she had raised their daughter so well, and something far more bitter: jealousy. Adeline walked toward the car, her expression calm, composed. There was a time when she would have watched him with careful anticipation, gauging his moods, tiptoeing around his presence. Not anymore. She was different now, stronger, self-assured in a way that made her feel untouchable. "Thanks for picking her up," she said, offering him a small but polite smile. "You're welcome," Theodore replied, glancing away. "It's the least I can do." They exchanged a few brief words about Emma's day. Pleasant, almost effortless, and yet, as Theodore pulled away from the house, he felt emptier than before. Emma's words echoed in his mind, looping over and over. "He's very nice. Mom seems happy." And for the first time, he wondered if he had spent so much time regretting the past that he had never truly considered what came next. For Adeline, there was no question. She had already moved forward. But could he? Lilia. The name lingered like an unwelcome guest, an unshakable reminder of everything he had lost. By the time Theodore stepped into his apartment, the silence pressed down on him, heavier than ever. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the weight of emptiness. He walked to the kitchen and grabbed a bottle of wine, turning it over in his hands before reaching for a glass. Then he stopped. Drinking wouldn't fix anything, and for once, he didn't want to drown it out. With a sigh, he set the bottle down and moved to the sofa, his gaze falling on the stack of Adeline's books still resting on the table. He had read them all, clinging to each page as if they might help him understand her again. But now, it felt like she was further away than ever. In the dead of night, his phone rang. The name on the screen made him pause. Caroline. For a moment he considered ignoring it, but guilt and obligation pulled at him, so he answered. "Theodore," she said, her voice hesitant. "Can we talk? I've been thinking about us." He closed his eyes, exhaustion washing over him. Clara was an incredible woman. He had always known that, but he also knew, deep in his core, that he couldn't give her what she deserved. Not now. "Caroline," he murmured, his voice quieter than he intended. I don't know if this is a good idea." A beat of silence. Then, her voice, firmer now. "I just want to understand what happened. I thought we were fine, but after that party everything fell apart. You pulled away, and then—" She hesitated, but when she spoke again there was no mistaking the hurt in her voice. "You called me Adeline." The silence stretched between them, suffocating in its weight. Theodore took a slow breath, trying to gather the words. "I'm sorry," he said at last, "for everything. But I think you deserve someone who isn't as lost as I am right now." "Lost?" Clara repeated, her voice quieter now. Then, after a pause, or still stuck on her. Theodore's throat tightened. He didn't answer. And that silence, that awful, damning silence, was all the confirmation Clara needed. She let out a breath, something between resignation and disappointment. "I see." Another pause. Then, softer. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Theodore, and I hope it's worth it." The line clicked dead before he could say a word. He lowered the phone onto the sofa beside him and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The apartment had never felt so empty, and neither had he. Theodore spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation, every glance, every word. Emma's quiet hesitation, Adeline's firm, measured tone, Caroline's painful realization. It all circled in his mind over and over. For so long he had avoided change, convincing himself that the life he led was enough. But now he saw it for what it was, a hollow illusion. And if he wanted to be more than just a shadow of the man he should have been, he had to start now. Not to win Adeline back, not to impress Caroline, not to ease his own guilt, but for himself. And, above all, for Emma. As the first light of dawn crept through the half-open curtains, Theodore sat on the edge of the bed, his body heavy with exhaustion, but his mind more awake than ever. The bottle of wine from the night before still sat untouched on the table, a quiet testament to a choice he hadn't even realized he was making. Adeline had moved on. Amelia had found warmth in another man's presence. And he was stuck in a whirlpool of regret and self-loathing. He exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. How long had he been sitting there? Minutes? Hours? Finally, he reached for his phone. He wanted to text Adeline, to insist on a conversation, to promise change. But every time he typed something, he erased it. Anything I say will just sound like an excuse. He stared at the blank screen. Adeline deserved more. Amelia deserved more. The words settled deep in his chest, pushing him into motion. Without another thought, he grabbed his coat and stepped out into the cool morning air. He had no real destination, only the desperate need to move, to breathe. He drove through the city, passing familiar streets and places that tugged at memories he had spent years burying. He thought about Adeline, about the beautiful, hopeful woman she had once been, before he had slowly chipped away at her light somewhere along the way. Without even realizing it, he pulled up in front of a small flower shop. He stepped inside, barely thinking, and bought a bouquet of white lilies, Adeline's favorite flowers. But as he walked back to his car, staring down at the delicate petals in his hands, realization struck him like a lightning bolt. It wasn't Adeline who needed flowers. It was Emma. Theodore arrived at the school earlier than usual, bouquet in hand. The other parents glanced at him, curiosity flickering in their expressions, but he ignored them. He wasn't here for them. When the school doors finally opened and the children poured out, Theodore scanned the crowd until he saw her. Emma. The moment her eyes landed on the bouquet, she stopped mid-step, blinking in surprise. "For me?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "Of course," Theodore said with a smile, kneeling slightly. "You deserve all the flowers in the world." Amelia took the bouquet gently, as if it were something fragile, precious. A small, shy smile spread across her face, one that made Theodore's chest tighten with something warm and unfamiliar. "They're so beautiful, Dad, thank you." She held the flowers close as they walked to the car, her fingers lightly grazing the petals. During the drive, she talked excitedly about her day, her friends, her upcoming science project, a funny joke her teacher had told. For the first time, Theodore found himself hanging on to her every word, truly listening. But then, as she absent-mindedly plucked at a petal, she said something that made his hands tighten on the steering wheel. "Lilia gives flowers to Mom, too. But you've never given her flowers before, have you?" Theodore felt his stomach drop. His eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, but Amelia was still playing with the bouquet, completely unaware of the weight her words carried. He swallowed, his throat dry. "No, Emma, I don't think so," he admitted, his voice quieter now. She shrugged, her innocence cutting deeper than she could ever know. "I guess you're trying now, huh?" Theodore opened his mouth, but no words came. She was right, he was trying now. But why had it taken so damn long? That evening, when he walked into his apartment, the silence greeted him like an old companion. He set his keys on the table, ran a hand through his hair, and exhaled. Then his phone rang. For a brief moment, something in his chest tightened. Adeline? But when he glanced at the screen, the name staring back at him wasn't hers. Caroline. A weight settled deep inside him. For a second, he considered letting it ring, ignoring it, avoiding yet another confrontation. But avoiding things was what had led him here in the first place. With a sigh, he picked up. "Hi, Caroline." "Theodore," she said, her tone calm but firm. "I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation, about how we ended. But before I move on, I think there are a few things I need to say." Theodore closed his eyes. There was no escaping this, and maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to. Theodore leaned back on the sofa, bracing himself for what was coming next. "You didn't realize it," Clara continued, her voice steady, "but I really tried to make things work between us." Theodore closed his eyes. He knew what was coming, but hearing it still cut deep. "I ignored the signs," she went on. "The moments when you were somewhere else, lost in thoughts of someone else. I told myself to be patient, that eventually you'd move on, that we would be enough. But the truth is, you never did. And I can't compete with that." "Caroline, I'm sorry," Theodore began, but she didn't let him finish. "I know you are," she said, her tone neither bitter nor angry. just tired. But you need to hear this. You're still stuck on Adeline. Maybe it's not even about love anymore. Maybe it's about regret, about all the things you didn't do, for her, for your daughter. Theodore exhaled slowly, his throat tight. There was no argument to make, because she was right. I hope you figure it out, Clara said, her voice softening. Not for me, not even for her, but for yourself. Because the way things are now, Theodore, you'll never be happy, and honestly, I deserve someone who's fully with me. You do, he admitted, and for the first time in a long time, he meant it. Clara let out a quiet breath, as if she had been waiting to hear those words. Take care, Theodore, she said, and then she was gone. Theodore sat there staring at the phone, feeling an emptiness that seemed to grow by the second. The days that followed were different. He focused on Emma, not just as an obligation or a way to ease his guilt, but because he wanted to. He picked her up and dropped her off at school. He listened when she talked about her favorite cartoons, her friends, the things that made her excited or nervous. He helped with her science project, something he never would have imagined doing before. Slowly, the space between them began to shrink, but even as he tried to be a better father, something else lingered. Adeline, Lilia, Emma's perfect boyfriend. The thought gnawed at him. He pictured Lilia, kind, reliable, the sort of man who never had to try to be good because he just was. Someone who made Adeline laugh again. Someone who wasn't him. By Thursday afternoon, as he sat in his car outside Emma's school, Theodore knew he couldn't keep avoiding it. He needed to talk to Adeline, not to win her back, not to justify himself, but to be honest. To finally say all the things he had been too afraid to say for so long. Adeline was in the middle of packing, folding clothes into her suitcase when the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, she was met with a sight she hadn't anticipated. Theodore, standing there with an expression unlike any she had ever seen on him. Serious, uncertain, exposed. Theodore, she said, instinctively crossing her arms. What are you doing here? I need to talk to you, he said, his voice low. It's important. Adeline hesitated but then stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. We don't have much time, she warned, her tone measured. I'm leaving with Amelia tomorrow. I know, Theodore said, his gaze steady. Amelia told me about the cruise. He hesitated before adding, and about Lilia. Adeline sighed, closing her eyes briefly. So, that's what this is about? No, he said quickly. Then, after a beat, maybe, in part. She arched an eyebrow but remained silent, waiting. Theodore exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face before finally speaking. I read your books, he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. All of them, and for the first time I understood. Adeline's posture stiffened, but she didn't say anything. I saw what you went through. I felt it, how much I hurt you, and more than that, I saw how much I failed Emma. A flicker of something crossed her face. Surprise, maybe, but still, she waited. Theodore swallowed. I was selfish, Adeline. I was so focused on work, on appearances, on chasing something I thought mattered that I never really saw you. I never saw what you needed. I never saw Emma. His voice grew quieter, and I'm sorry for everything. The silence stretched between them, heavy but not hostile. Adeline's face remained neutral, but her eyes. They held something he couldn't quite name. Regret, sadness, read even, understanding. I'm not here to ask for anything, Theodore continued. Not another chance, not forgiveness. I just needed you to know that I recognize what I've done, and that I'm trying to change. For Emma, and maybe a little for myself. For the first time since he arrived, Adeline's arms dropped to her sides. She sighed, the weight of his words settling over her. I believe you're trying, she said finally, her voice softer. And I hope you keep trying. For Emma, especially. Theodore nodded, feeling a quiet sense of relief wash over him. But then she hesitated, and when she spoke again, her words were careful, deliberate. But as for me, I've moved on. His breath caught slightly, but he didn't interrupt. I think you should too, she continued, her voice gentle but firm, not out of anger or resentment, but because sometimes people just don't belong together anymore. Theodore swallowed, forcing down the tightness in his throat. "I understand," he said, and for once he truly did. A pause. And then Adeline did something unexpected. She smiled, small but sincere. "Be a good father to Emma," she said. "That's all that matters now." And, for the first time in years, Theodore felt like he finally knew exactly what he needed to do. As Theodore stepped out of Adeline's house, he felt a strange sensation. Lightness. The weight he had carried for so long, the regret, the guilt, it wasn't gone, but it no longer suffocated him. The road ahead would still be long, full of uncertainties, but for the first time he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. A week later, when Amelia returned from the cruise, Theodore was exactly where he had promised to be, waiting outside the school gates. It had become part of him now, a fixed point in his routine. Picking up Amelia wasn't just an obligation, it was an anchor, something that kept him focused, grounded. He didn't know if Adeline realized how much it meant to him, but Amelia was beginning to. When she came through the school gates, dragging her backpack and chatting animatedly with a friend, Theodore waved. Emma's face lit up. "Dad," she called, before running straight into his arms. He hugged her tightly, feeling a warmth in his chest that no amount of success or wealth had ever given him. "Hey, my angel," he greeted, ruffling her hair. "How was your first day back?" Amelia hesitated for a moment, her smile fading slightly. "It was good," she said, trailing off. "But there's something I wanted to tell you." Theodore immediately took notice of the shift in her tone. He opened the car door for her. "All right," he said gently. "We can talk on the way." They had been driving for a few minutes, the hum of traffic filling the silence, when Amelia finally spoke. Mom and Lilia broke up. Theodore's hands momentarily tightened on the steering wheel. He glanced at Amelia through the rearview mirror, studying her expression. "Really?" he asked carefully. "And you're okay with that?" Amelia shrugged, staring out the window. "I guess so. Actually, I don't think he was as nice as he seemed at first." Theodore kept his expression neutral, but inside something tensed. A quiet satisfaction crept in, one he wasn't proud of. "Why do you say that, Emma?" She shifted in her seat, playing with the strap of her backpack. "Because on the cruise he was different. At first he was fun, but then he started complaining about everything." Theodore frowned. "Like what?" Amelia sighed. "Like if I wanted to stay in the pool longer, or if Mom wanted to do something with me instead of him. He always seemed, I don't know, annoyed? Like he was waiting for Mom to stop paying attention to me." Theodore's stomach twisted. So, that was it. Lilia, the man he had imagined as perfect, as better, hadn't been what he seemed. And that scared Theodore more than he wanted to admit. "And your mom?" he asked after a pause. "What did she think about that?" Amelia was quiet for a moment, lost in thought. "I think she was sad," she finally said. "But she told me something. She said she doesn't want to be with someone who doesn't like me exactly as I am. She said we should always listen to our instincts." Amelia paused before adding, "And I think her instincts told her it wasn't going to work out." Theodore glanced at his daughter through the rearview mirror, his grip on the steering wheel tightening slightly. "Your mother is very wise, Emma," he said, "and she's right. You deserve to be surrounded by people who love and respect you exactly as you are." Amelia smiled, settling back into her seat. "Yeah, I guess so." The rest of the drive was uneventful, but Theodore's mind was anything but still. He wondered how Adeline felt about all of this. He knew how deeply she valued Emma's happiness, but he also knew how hard it was to let go of something, or someone, that once felt like a promise of happiness. And that thought stayed with him. Flashback to the cruise. At first, everything had seemed perfect. Lilia was charming and attentive, just as he had been from the beginning. He helped Amelia with the deck games, made Adeline laugh with his stories, and held her hand while they watched the sunset over the ocean. It felt right. Or at least, that's what Adeline had wanted to believe. But as the days passed, something began to shift. Lilia's patience started to thin. At first, it was subtle. A sigh here, a glance at his watch there. Then it became more obvious. If Amelia wanted to stay in the pool longer, he would roll his eyes. "Again, Emma, can't we do something more adult?" Adeline noticed, and though discomfort crept in, she pushed it aside. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he just needed to adjust. But then came the night at the ship's restaurant. They were seated at a quiet corner table, candlelight flickering between them. Emma, beaming with excitement, began telling Lilia about her adventures at the kids' club. She spoke quickly, her words tumbling over each other in enthusiasm. Then, mid-sentence, Lilia cut her off. "Emma, could you keep it down a bit? We're in a restaurant." Silence. Amelia froze, her expression falling, eyes lowering to her plate. Adeline's stomach clenched. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking. "Lilia, she's just excited. You don't have to talk to her like that." Lilia held up his hands, his expression exasperated. All right, I'm just asking for a little consideration." But Adeline felt it in that moment. The shift, the undeniable realization settling in the pit of her stomach. And as the days continued, she started seeing the pattern she had been trying to ignore. Lilia was growing more impatient, more distant, and Adeline could no longer pretend she didn't see what had been there all along. Lilia had no patience for motherhood. And that was a deal-breaker. Flashback to the last night of the cruise. Lilia liked Adeline, that much was clear. But he didn't seem to understand that liking her meant accepting all of her, and that included Emma. On their final night aboard the cruise, while Amelia slept soundly in the cabin's bedroom, Adeline confronted him. "You're not the same person I thought I knew," she said, arms crossed, her voice unwavering. Lilia sighed, rubbing his temples as if she was being unreasonable. "Oh, Adeline, you're exaggerating," he said, exasperated. "It's just, sometimes, it's hard to deal with kids. I thought that now, with Theodore stepping up, you could share the responsibilities more." Adeline blinked, stunned into silence. She had expected many things from this conversation, but not that. "Share the responsibilities?" she repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of his words. "Lilia, Amelia isn't a burden. She's my daughter. She's my priority." Lilia groaned, clearly frustrated. "That's not what I meant." But Adeline had heard enough. "If you think her place in my life is negotiable," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "then I don't think we have anything left to discuss." Lilia opened his mouth as if to argue, but Adeline had already made up her mind. She had been in this position before, choosing between someone's expectations and her daughter's well-being. She wasn't going to repeat the mistakes of the past. Back to the present. The next afternoon, while waiting outside Emma's school, Theodore sat in his car, drumming his fingers lightly against the steering wheel. His mind kept circling back to Adeline. He felt a strange mix of admiration and concern. He knew how difficult it must have been for her to make that decision, to walk away from something that had seemed like happiness. But he also knew one thing for certain: Adeline would always put Amelia first, and that mattered more than anything. When Amelia finally emerged from the school gates, she looked lighter than the day before, a little brighter. She climbed into the car, buckling her seatbelt before launching into a rapid-fire recap of her day. Her classes, her friends, a funny joke someone had told during lunch. The Theodore listened, absorbing every detail, noticing something subtle but important. She seemed calmer, as if a cloud had passed casually. As he pulled away from the curb, he asked, "How's your mom?" "She's fine," Amelia said easily. "Last night we made popcorn and watched a movie. She was laughing a lot." Theodore smiled, a quiet relief settling in his chest. "That's good," he murmured. Then after a pause he added, "You know, your mom is an incredible woman. You're lucky to have her." Amelia nodded, thoughtful. "I know," she said simply. Then, after a beat, she looked at him and added, "And I think she deserves someone who's really nice." She hesitated, then smiled. "Like you're trying to be." Theodore felt something tighten in his chest. But for the first time in a long time, that tightness wasn't guilt. It was hope. He didn't know exactly where this journey would take him, but he knew one thing for sure. He would keep trying, not just for Emma, but for himself. And perhaps, for the faintest remnant of hope, that one day Adeline might see him again, not as the man he once was, but as the man he was becoming. And whether it took months or years, he was willing to do whatever it took to earn her love back. Not with words, not with grand gestures, but by showing up, by being the kind of man she and Emma deserved. A few days later, it was the kind of afternoon Adeline loved. calm, bright, with just the right amount of city noise humming in the background. Theodore parked his car outside the downtown bookstore, his pulse steady but deliberate. He knew she would be here. Over the past few months, he had learned to recognize her rhythms, the way she spent her afternoons absorbed in books, sketching out ideas, molding stories in the quiet corners of coffee shops. Their relationship had shifted into something new, not husband and wife, but allies, co-parents. They were building something, not out of nostalgia or longing, but for Emma, and in doing so, Theodore had come to realize something unexpected. Being present, showing up, day after day, wasn't just for Emma. It had changed him too. It had made him see Adeline in a way he never had before. When he stepped into the bookstore, he spotted her immediately. She was sitting near the window, a cup of coffee beside her, a notebook open in front of her. She looked at peace, lighter somehow, as if she had finally shed the weight of the past. Theodore took a slow breath before walking over. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, his voice softer than usual. Adeline looked up, surprise flickering across her features before she relaxed. "Theodore?" she said, tilting her head slightly. "No, it's fine. I'm just trying to organize some ideas for a new book." He slid into the chair across from her, uninvited, but she didn't seem to mind. "A new book?" he asked, glancing at the closed notebook. "Is it another novel?" "Maybe," she replied, fingers brushing over the cover. "It's still in the early stages, nothing too definite yet." Theodore nodded, his interest genuine. "You know you have incredible talent, right? Your books are impressive." Adeline arched an eyebrow, her expression amused yet cautious. "You've told me that before," she said, studying him. "But it still sounds strange coming from you." Theodore let out a short laugh, one without humor, but full of something else, something real. "Yeah," he admitted, shaking his head. "I guess a lot of things sound strange coming from me these days." And somehow, for the first time in a long time, the silence between them didn't feel so heavy. Theodore exhaled, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the table. "I deserve that, I guess," he admitted, a self-deprecating smile flickering across his lips. "In the past, I never gave you or your talent the recognition you deserved, but I'm trying to change that now." Adeline studied him carefully, her expression unreadable. "And," he continued, adjusting his tone, "there's something I wanted to talk to you about." She tilted her head slightly, intrigued. "What is it?" He hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I've been thinking," he leaned forward. "What if we organized an exhibition for you at the next book biennial? Something that celebrates your career, your books, your impact as a writer?" Adeline blinked. She had clearly not been expecting that. "Are you serious?" "Completely," he said, nodding. "I've already made some contacts. I know I can put something special together. It would be a way to show the world what you stand for, and maybe even encourage you to finish this new book you're working on." For a long moment, Adeline was silent. The Theodore could see the flicker of emotion in her eyes, excitement warring with hesitation. "Theodore," she finally said, her voice softer now, "why are you doing this?" "Because you deserve it," he replied without hesitation. He held her gaze, willing her to see the truth in his words. "For too long, I was blind to what you were capable of. I was selfish, and I let my own ambition overshadow yours. But I believe in you, Adeline. I always have." He let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "I was just too stupid to show it." Adeline searched his face for any sign of falsehood, but found none. For the first time, she saw something in Theodore she hadn't seen in years. Genuine sincerity. She exhaled, a small, almost shy smile appearing. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "Then say yes," he said, a hint of playfulness returning to his voice. "Let me do this for you." She hesitated a beat longer, then finally, she nodded. "All right, but only if you promise not to overdo it." Theodore raised his hands in mock surrender. "I promise." But deep down, he knew this was something he would overdo, because for the first time in his life, he wanted to make sure Adeline had the spotlight she had always deserved. The following weeks, what started as an idea quickly became a full-fledged mission. The Theodore threw himself into the planning, organizing every detail, details he would have once handed off to an assistant without a second thought. But this wasn't business. This was personal. For the first time, he wasn't just doing something for Adeline out of obligation or guilt. He was doing it because he believed in her, and he was determined to prove it. The final preparations. Theodore poured himself into the project with an intensity that surprised even him. He carefully selected photos that captured the defining moments of Adeline's career. Her first book launch, her most acclaimed interviews, the milestones that had shaped her into the writer she was today. He secured partnerships with publishers, reached out to industry leaders, and, against all odds, managed to arrange one of the biennial's biggest talks in her honor. For the first time, Adeline's work would be celebrated on a scale it had always deserved. But as the event neared, Adeline found herself torn. She couldn't ignore Theodore's dedication, the way he truly seemed invested, not just in the exhibition, but in Emma's life as well. Still, a quiet fear lingered. Allowing herself to trust him again meant opening a door she had closed long ago. And she wasn't sure if she was ready, but slowly, bit by bit, as she watched his unwavering effort, her guard began to slip. The day of the biennial. When the day of the event finally arrived, Adeline stepped into the exhibition hall and felt her breath hitch. It was perfect, elegant, thoughtfully curated, a space that didn't just showcase her books but who she was, both as a writer and as a woman. For the first time, she felt truly seen. As she moved through the crowd, greeting visitors and speaking with the press, she caught sight of Theodore standing with Amelia a short distance away. He wasn't trying to take the spotlight, but the way he watched her, proud, steady, told her everything nearby. Amelia tugged on her father's arm. "She looks so happy," she whispered. Theodore smiled, his gaze still on Adeline. "She deserves to be." After the exhibition, the event had been a resounding success. As the crowds thinned, Adeline found Theodore and Amelia tucked away in a quiet corner of the biennial. She was still overwhelmed, by gratitude, by disbelief, by something she wasn't quite ready to name. She met Theodore's gaze, sincerity shining through her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. This was more than I ever could have imagined." Theodore shook his head. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice just as sincere. "I only did what I should have done a long time ago." Adeline smiled, but there was something else there now. Something unspoken. "You know, Theodore," she murmured, studying him, "I don't know exactly when it happened, but I've noticed that you've changed." Her voice was measured, cautious. "And as hard as it was at first, I'm beginning to believe that this change is real." Theodore held her gaze. "It is real," he assured her. "I know I hurt you and Emma. I can't change the past, but I can spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it." Adeline inhaled slowly, absorbing his words. And for the first time, she believed him. "I believe you." The words lingered between them, soft yet profound. For the first time, Theodore felt something shift, something real, something earned. Adeline had no idea how much those 3 words meant to him, and neither did he, until now. In the months that followed, life took an unexpected yet completely natural turn. At first, it had just been about Emma, the shared school pickups, the weekends together, but somewhere along the way they changed too. The Theodore and Adeline began spending more time together, not out of obligation, but because it felt right. They rediscovered the little things, the way they used to laugh, the ease of their conversations, the spark of understanding that had once drawn them together. Adeline, fueled by newfound inspiration, started working on her next book. And Theodore? He became her biggest supporter. He read every draft she shared, offering thoughtful feedback, suggesting ideas, encouraging her in ways he never had before. And in return, Adeline started seeing him again, not as the man she had left behind, but as the man he had become. One evening at Adeline's house, the scent of home-cooked food filled the air as Theodore stirred the pasta sauce on the stove. Across the room, Amelia sat beside Adeline, giggling as they scrolled through something on the computer screen. It was a simple moment, nothing extravagant, nothing grand. Just a man cooking dinner, a mother and daughter sharing laughter. But for everyone in that house, it was so much more than that. It was togetherness. It was home. When dinner was ready, they gathered around the table. Theodore hesitated for a moment before raising his glass of wine. His throat tightened slightly, but he pushed through it. He exhaled, looking at Adeline, then Emma. I wanted to say something." Both of them turned to him expectantly. "You two mean everything to me," he continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know it took me a long time to realize it, but you saved me from myself, and for that, I just want to say thank you." Adeline's expression softened as she reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand. "We're a family, Theodore," she said simply, "and that's what matters." Amelia beamed, lifting her glass of juice high. "To our family." Theodore and Adeline exchanged a knowing glance before lifting their own glasses. "To our family," they repeated in unison. As laughter filled the room, the weight of the past finally faded into the background, exactly where it belonged. The future, bright, open, theirs to build, was waiting, and this time, they would build it together. Did you enjoy this story? If so, drop a like and leave a kind comment to encourage us. Your support means the world. And don't forget, we love you.